The president also met privately with the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, and the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Tomorrow, he's expected to speak at the US-Africa Business Forum. To discuss, we're now joined by our UN correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Peace in New York. Sherwin, thank you for joining us. Let's start with today's event. This comes after David Cameron was heavily criticized for Libya. We saw those strong words from our president there. Just tell us a bit more about what he had to say, what was discussed today.
Well, I think the president making a very broad point that there are a number of causes and reasons why we are seeing the levels of mass migration that we see, people trying to get across the Mediterranean into Europe. He calls into question the international intervention in Libya, which he says was a driver of the excesses and the levels of migration that we are seeing today. He also, though, made a very strong point about underdevelopment. The declaration, Francis, that was adopted today points very specifically to questions of human rights, the undermining of individuals' human rights that causes people in the first place to leave their homes and to seek greener pastures elsewhere. So the president really drawing attention to the fact also that this is not a new phenomenon. Just because you have the media's attention on the mass migration we are seeing across the Mediterranean into Europe doesn't mean that this was not a phenomenon that existed before this. Perhaps the vast numbers of refugees, one thinks about the over 1 million refugees you have emanating from South Sudan today, perhaps it didn't grab the world's media attention as the European case has. And I think making the point that this is a global problem and it should stay as a global problem on the world's arena, on the world's radar.
All right, Sherwin, this comes ahead of the debate of the UN General Assembly, and we, I think as you've reported before, are likely to push for reform, especially of the Security Council, which makes these crucial decisions, but there's a few members of that council. There was a meeting with Ban Ki-moon and President Zuma yesterday. As far as I can remember, there's been lots of meetings, Ban Ki-moon nearing the end of his term. How much closer is the body to actually accepting reform?
So the question then, Francis, is the world much closer? The answer to that is no. Do they talk about it a lot? Every time they come to New York, absolutely. There is an intergovernmental process, as you mentioned, a bit like the SDGs, or if you remember the negotiations around climate change and the Paris Accord reached in December last year. But this process has ebbed a lot and not flowed very much in the over 2 decades that we've been talking about UN reform. And I asked this question of the outgoing president of the General Assembly, who is the driver of the intergovernmental process about a week ago, said that there are two different blocks in the UN membership. One is you have, for example, a group, two is a part of the. It's another group led by Italy called United for Consensus. They want an expansion of the Security Council, but not in the permanent category, which means you have access to the veto. You also have a group called the G4, India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan, who all want permanent seats. And to effect any change, you need 75% of the general membership of the UN to agree on that change. And then, here's the kicker. It needs to then be approved by the Security Council with 5 permanent members who have very different interests when it comes to whether they want to extend the veto to other countries and the expansion of the Council. So that's just a sense of how complicated it is.
All right, Sherwin, I think you've finished speaking. You're cutting in and out, but let's try and continue with this. You did speak to the International Relations and Cooperation Minister, and I guess this is a long way off, like you say, but we're certainly talking about it. Did you get the feeling that South Africa is really expecting one of those seats that will go, if reform comes, to Africa?
Well, whatever they tell you, Francis, take it from me, they are expecting it. I think President Zuma has been on record that saying South Africa should get a permanent seat. The minister yesterday saying it would be, quote, abnormal for a country like South Africa not to be put forward by Africa for one of those 2 permanent seats. Now, how this will play on in the continent, one remembers the recent election to the AU Commission chair of Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and we saw this English Africa divide versus the French Africa divide. And one wonders if that sort of thing will play out again when it comes to selecting the two countries that they want for those permanent seats. If, in fact, we do get to the point where Africa is allocated two permanent seats. We know Nigeria is very keen as the largest economy in Africa. Egypt has also been very vocal about wanting a permanent seat. So there's a discussion that needs to happen. And some of the diplomats here have been criticizing the Africa group for not being specific as to who would fill those seats. But the minister making the point in our discussion yesterday that there's no point in fighting over two seats when the two seats, in fact, don't exist yet.
Well, a possible future bun fight brewing. Sherwin, the sound is much better. So let's close with just what else is on South Africa's agenda in New York.
The question is what's not on the agenda, Francis. The AU Peace and Security Council, a meeting of heads of state here in New York on the question of South Sudan. That is a closed meeting that is going on right now as I'm speaking to you. There is also a high-level meeting on antimicrobial research, which South Africa is very, very much involved in. South Africa is essentially wanting to position itself, Francis, as a center for the development and the distribution of new antibiotics. There's a concern in the world today that diseases caused by bacteria and viruses, that they are not the requisite number, the requisite power in antibiotics to counter these diseases. So a lot of research, we need stronger antibiotics, and the risk is that 300 million people could die if we do not develop adequate antibiotics by 2050. There's a Commission on Health, Employment and Economic Growth, which President Zuma chaired, is handing over a report to the Secretary General. One just thinks about the Ebola outbreak and some of the lessons learned from that. So a number of issues. You also mentioned the U.S.-Africa Business Summit. That's not happening tomorrow. It's happening on Wednesday. President Zuma expected to speak there. Of course, that hosted by President Barack Obama.
All right. Thank you so much, Sherwin Bryce-Pease from the UN headquarters in New York. We take a short break. More news after.